They had 90 seconds to live. 15 American airmen shot down over enemy waters. Bleeding, broken, barely conscious, scattered across miles of open ocean with nothing but their life vests and fading hope. Below them, sharks were circling, and in the Pacific, they don't circle for long. Above them, Japanese artillery batteries pounded the water with everything they had. This was Kavian Harbor, February 15, 1944. One of the most heavily defended Japanese positions in the entire Pacific. Every American commander knew the rule. You do not attempt rescue in active fire zones. You do not risk more lives for men already counted as dead. And these 15 men were already dead on paper. No destroyer could reach them in time. No submarine would surface into a kill zone. No fighter pilot could scoop them from the waves. But there was one man watching from above. A Navy lieutenant flying a plane so slow and so fragile, the Japanese called it the flying coffin. His name was Nathan Gordon, and at that moment, he was doing the math in his head. 15 men, miles apart, enemy guns locked onto his position, and a plane that could barely take off when it was empty, let alone loaded with survivors. Every calculation said the same thing. Impossible. His co-pilot looked at him and said what everyone was thinking. Sir, if we land down there, we're not coming back up. Gordon didn't argue, didn't give a speech, didn't radio for permission. He pushed the controls forward and aimed his plane straight at the ocean. What followed was not just a rescue, but 4 separate suicide runs into a wall of Japanese gunfire, each more impossible than the last. By the time the sun set, Nathan Gordon had done something military historians still struggle to explain. He saved every single man. This is the true story of one of the most insane rescue missions of World War II. And what happened will make you question everything you thought you knew about human courage. To understand what Nathan Gordon did on February 15, 1944, you need to understand who he was before that day. Because here's the thing, Nathan Gordon wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't some hotshot fighter pilot with a chest full of medals. He wasn't the guy they wrote about in newspapers back home. He wasn't even the guy his own squadron expected to do anything remarkable. Nathan Gordon was born on September 4, 1916. In Morrilton, Arkansas, a tiny town where nothing much happened and nobody much left, his father was a farmer. His mother raised chickens. The biggest excitement in Nathan's childhood was watching trains pass through on their way to somewhere more important. But Nathan had a dream that made no sense for a farm boy from Arkansas. He wanted to fly. Not just fly. He wanted to join the Navy and become a pilot, which, in 1930s Arkansas, was like saying you wanted to become an astronaut. People laughed. His teachers smiled politely and suggested he consider something more realistic. Nathan didn't listen. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny, put himself through college at Arkansas Tech, and then, against all odds, talked his way into Navy flight training. Now, here's where you need to pay attention. Because the Navy didn't hand Nathan Gordon a sleek fighter plane, they didn't give him a powerful bomber. They didn't assign him to some elite squadron where glory was guaranteed. They gave him a PBY Catalina. And if you don't know what a PBY Catalina is, let me paint you a picture. Imagine the slowest, clumsiest, most vulnerable aircraft in the entire American military. Now imagine it's even slower than that. The PBY Catalina was a flying boat, a massive, lumbering seaplane designed in the 1930s. It had a wingspan of 104 feet. It weighed over 35,000 pounds, fully loaded. Its top speed was 196 miles per hour, which sounds fast until you realize Japanese Zero fighters could do 350 against enemy aircraft. But Catalina was a sitting duck. Against anti-aircraft guns, it was target practice. The pilots who flew them had a dark nickname for the plane, the flying coffin. So why did the Navy keep using them? Because the Catalina could do one thing no other plane could: land on water. Its hull was designed like a boat. It could touch down on open ocean, taxi across waves, and take off again, assuming nothing went wrong. And in the Pacific War, that made the Catalina invaluable for one specific mission: search and rescue. When American pilots got shot down over the ocean, when sailors survived torpedo attacks, when Marines got stranded on remote islands, someone had to go get them. That someone was usually a PBY Catalina crew. And by February 1944, that crew was Nathan Gordon's. Nathan Gordon was assigned to VP-34, Patrol Squadron 34, based out of Samurai, New Guinea. New Guinea in 1944 was hell on earth. The heat was unbearable. The humidity made you feel like you were breathing underwater. Malaria killed more men than Japanese bullets. And the jungle swallowed everything. Planes that crashed into the canopy were never found. Men who wandered off trails disappeared forever. Equipment rusted within weeks. This wasn't the glamorous war people saw in newsreels back home. This was survival at its most brutal. And Nathan Gordon's job: fly out over enemy waters, find downed American airmen, and bring them back. Sounds simple, right? It wasn't, because enemy waters meant Japanese-controlled territory. It meant flying slow, unarmed rescue missions directly into areas where enemy fighters hunted and anti-aircraft guns waited. The survival rate for PBY crews in combat zones was horrifying. Between 1942 and 1945, The Navy lost over 200 Catalinas in the Pacific, many with all hands. The men who flew them didn't talk about whether they'd get shot down. They talked about when. Nathan Gordon had already flown dozens of these missions by February 1944. He'd seen friends die. He'd watched planes explode midair. He'd pulled half-dead men from shark-infested waters, while Japanese bullets stitched the waves around him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was coming. Let's set the scene. By early 1944, the Allies were pushing hard against Japanese positions across the Pacific, island by island, base by base. The American war machine was grinding forward, but the Japanese weren't giving up easily. They had fortified positions throughout the region, and one of the most dangerous was Cavite. Cavite was a port town on the northern tip of New Ireland, a long, narrow island east of New Guinea. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the harbor. Fighter squadrons operated from nearby airstrips. Warships patrolled the waters. For American forces, Cavite was a meat grinder. Attacking it meant accepting heavy casualties. But on February 15, 1944, American commanders decided to hit it anyway. The mission was straightforward. Send bombers to neutralize Japanese positions. Soften up the defenses. Prepare for future operations. What actually happened was very, very different. That morning, American B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from bases in New Guinea. Their target is Cavite Harbor. The plan: fly in fast, drop bombs, and fly out faster. The Japanese had other ideas. The moment those bombers entered Cavite airspace, the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft fire came from everywhere. From the shore, from the ships, from positions hidden in the jungle that intelligence hadn't even identified. It was a wall of flak. Tracers crisscrossed the sky like deadly explosions rocked planes. Within minutes, the mission turned into a disaster. One bomber took a direct hit to its fuel tank and exploded, crew gone in an instant. Another lost an engine and started trailing smoke, the pilot fighting desperately to maintain altitude. A third took shrapnel through the cockpit, killing the co-pilot and wounding the navigator. And then things got worse. Japanese Zero fighters scrambled from nearby airstrips and tore into the American formation. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable. Deadly, they picked off damaged bombers like wolves hunting wounded prey. Plane after plane went down. Some exploded in midair, there 1 second, a fireball the next. Some spiraled into the jungle, no survivors possible. And some made it to the water. That's where our story really begins. By mid-morning on February 15, 1944, at least 15 American airmen were in the water near Cavite Harbor. 15 men who had survived being shot down, 15 men who had managed to bail out or crash land, 15 men who were now floating in the open ocean with nothing but their life vests. But survival was measured in minutes, not hours. The water was too warm. Sharks thrived in these waters. Blood attracted them. Movement attracted them. And 15 bleeding, splashing airmen were like ringing a dinner bell. That wasn't even the biggest problem. The Japanese knew exactly where those men were. Artillery batteries on shore had watched the planes go down. They knew survivors were in the water, and they started shooting. Not to kill the airmen yet, to kill anyone who tried to rescue them. The Japanese understood American psychology. They knew the Americans wouldn't abandon their own. They knew rescue attempts would come, so they waited. Guns were trained on the crash sites, ready to destroy any rescue craft that dared approach. This was a trap, a carefully laid trap using dying men as bait, and every American commander in the region knew it. When word reached Allied headquarters that 15 men were down near Cavite, the reaction was immediate, and it was grim. Standard military protocol was clear. Do not attempt rescue in active combat zones with heavy enemy presence. The risk of losing additional men and equipment was too high. Write them off. Mark them as missing in action. Move on. 15 families would get 15 telegrams. 15 mothers would cry, and the war would continue. That was the calculus of war. Cold, brutal, necessary. But someone didn't get that memo. Or more accurately, someone got that memo and decided to ignore it. At approximately 0900 hours, APBY Catalina was already in the air, conducting routine patrol operations east of New Guinea. The pilot was Lieutenant Nathan Gordon. Gordon's radio crackled with scattered reports of bombers down near Cavite, survivors possibly in the water, situation extremely dangerous. This wasn't his assigned mission. He was supposed to be on patrol. His orders said nothing about rescue operations in heavily defended enemy harbors. Most pilots would have radioed for guidance. Most pilots would have waited for official orders. Most pilots would have recognized that flying toward Cavite was suicide. Nathan Gordon changed course immediately. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He simply pointed his plane toward the most dangerous place in the Pacific and pushed the throttle forward. His crew looked at each other. They knew what this meant. They were flying into a kill zone in an aircraft that couldn't fight back, couldn't outrun enemy fighters, and couldn't survive sustained anti-aircraft fire. Their chances of coming back alive were almost zero, and not a single man objected. Before we go further, you need to meet the men who flew with Nathan Gordon that day. because he didn't do this alone. Every man on that Catalina made the same choice, to fly toward death to save strangers. The crew of Gordon's PBY Catalina included Ensign Robert Anson, co-pilot, 23 years old, from Michigan. He'd wanted to be a commercial pilot before the war. Now he spent his days flying over shark-infested waters, wondering if each mission would be his last. Chief Aviation Machinists, mate Earl Rutherford, flight engineer, the oldest man on the crew at 30. He knew the Catalina better than anyone, every bolt, every wire, every weakness. He also knew exactly how fragile the plane was. Aviation radioman, First Class James Taylor, radio operator. His job was communication, picking up distress signals, coordinating with other aircraft, and calling for help if things went wrong. If things went wrong on this mission, no help would arrive in time, and there were other gunners, mechanics, and navigators. Each one of them is a volunteer. Each one of them understood what they were flying into. These men weren't famous. History books don't mention most of their names, but every single one of them deserves to be remembered. Because when Nathan Gordon made his impossible choice, they backed him without hesitation. That's the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines. The quiet kind. They all follow you into hell kind, and hell was exactly where they were heading. The Catalina approached Aviation harbor at approximately 1,000 hours. 1 hour after the bombing raid had fallen apart. From altitude, Gordon could see the aftermath. Smoke columns rose from the water where planes had crashed. Oil slicks spread across the surface. Dark, ugly stains marking where aircraft had gone down. Debris floated everywhere. Pieces of wings, fragments of fuselage, objects that might have been equipment or might have been and there, scattered across miles of open water, tiny dots of orange and yellow. Life vests. 15 men. Still alive? Still waiting? Still hoping. But Gordon saw something else, too. Gun emplacements along the shore. He could see them clearly, artillery batteries positioned to cover the water. Crews were visible, moving around the weapons. And those weapons were pointed directly at the crash sites. The Japanese were ready. They were waiting. Gordon did a quick calculation in his head. To rescue those men, he'd have to land his Catalina on open water, in full view of enemy guns. The landing process took time. Taxiing to survivors took time. Loading injured men took time. Taking off again, if the overloaded plane could even take off, took time. Time he wouldn't have. The moment he touched down, those guns would open fire. His big, slow, lumbering aircraft would be the easiest target in the Pacific. Any sane person would turn around. Any reasonable assessment said this was impossible. Any military regulation said to abort. Nathan Gordon looked at his co-pilot. "We're going in." Ensign Anson didn't hesitate. "Roger that, sir." And with those words, they began their descent into the most dangerous rescue mission of World War II. Now, here's where the story gets truly insane. Because Nathan Gordon didn't just land once. He didn't save 1 or 2 men and call it a victory. He landed 4 separate times, each time under direct enemy fire. Each time his plane was taking more damage. Each time with the odds were stacked higher against him. How did he do it? How did any of them survive? That's exactly what we're about to find out. But first, let's zoom in on that first landing. Because what happened when Gordon's plane touched the water was unlike anything the Japanese defenders expected. The descent toward Aviation harbor felt like falling into the mouth of a beast. Nathan Gordon pushed the Catalina's nose down, watching the altimeter spin backward as the ocean rushed up to meet them. At 5,000 feet, he could see the Japanese gun positions clearly. Dark shapes against the green jungle, crews moving like ants around their weapons. At 3,000 feet, he could see the survivors in the water, tiny orange specks bobbing in an endless blue expanse. At 1,000 feet, he could see the sharks. They were circling, patient, hungry. The men in the water were splashing, trying to stay together, trying to stay alive. They had maybe 30 minutes before the sharks got bold enough to attack, maybe less. Gordon didn't have time for a careful approach. He didn't have time for textbook procedures. He had time for one thing only: get down there and start pulling men out of the water. Before they became fish food, the Catalina hit the water hard. Too hard. The impact slammed through the airframe like a hammer blow, rattling teeth and shaking loose equipment throughout the cabin. Salt spray exploded across the windscreen, momentarily blinding Gordon and his co-pilot. The engine screamed as Gordon fought to keep the plane stable, the hull bouncing across the waves like a stone skipping across a pond. For 3 terrifying seconds, he thought the plane would flip. The Catalina's left wing dipped dangerously close to the water one touch, and they'd cartwheel, the aircraft disintegrating around them. But Gordon wrestled the controls with everything he had, and somehow the plane steadied. They were down, they were floating, they were alive, and that's when the Japanese opened fire. The first shell landed 50 yards to their left. A massive geyser of water erupted into the sky, the shockwave rocking the Catalina sideways. Gordon didn't flinch. He'd expected this. He'd planned for this. What he hadn't planned for was how accurate the Japanese gunners would be. The second shell landed 30 yards away. The third, 20. They were walking their fire toward the Catalina with mechanical precision, each shot closer than the last. At this rate, they had maybe 60 seconds before a direct hit turned their rescue mission into a funeral. Gordon slammed the throttles forward, and the Catalina lurched into motion, engines roaring as the big flying boat began taxiing across the harbor toward the nearest cluster of survivors. The plane wasn't designed for this. It was meant to land, conduct operations in calm water, and take off again. It wasn't meant to dodge artillery fire while bouncing across choppy seas at maximum speed. But Gordon didn't have a choice. He pushed the aircraft harder than it had ever been pushed. The hull groaning in protest, water spraying everywhere, shells exploding around them like the world's deadliest fireworks display. The first survivors came into view. 3 men clinging to a piece of wreckage, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. They'd watched the Catalina descend. They'd seen it land, and they couldn't believe anyone was crazy enough to attempt a rescue in this hellscape. One of the men, Gordon would later learn his name was Lieutenant Harold Sargent, actually tried to wave the Catalina away. He was screaming something, his words lost in the thunder of explosions and engine noise, his arms making frantic go-back gestures. He thought he was saving the rescue crew by refusing rescue. He thought he was being noble. Gordon ignored him completely. The Catalina swung alongside the wreckage, and crew members threw open the side hatches. Chief Rutherford and 2 other men leaned out over the water, arms extended, screaming at the survivors to grab on. For a moment, nobody moved. The 3 men in the water just stared, paralyzed by shock and exhaustion, and the sheer impossibility of what was happening. Then a shell landed close enough to shower them all with spray, and survival instinct kicked in. Lieutenant Sargent grabbed the nearest extended hand and was hauled bodily into the aircraft. Water streaming from his flight suit, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. The second man followed a young sergeant whose name nobody caught in the chaos, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The third man was unconscious, kept afloat only by his life vest, and it took 3 crew members working together to drag his limp body through the hatch. The whole process took less than 2 minutes. It felt like 2 hours. Japanese shells were landing all around them now, close enough that shrapnel pinged against the Catalina's thin aluminum skin, close enough that the spray from each explosion was drenching the men working at the hatches, close enough that everyone absolutely knew the next shot could be the one that ended everything. Gordon didn't wait for the hatches to close. The moment the third survivor was aboard, he was already pushing the throttles forward, the Catalina pivoting in the water, engines screaming as he aimed for the next cluster of survivors. There were 2 more men, about 400 yards to the east. Gordon could see them, 2 orange dots against the blue, waving frantically, alive, but for how much longer, he couldn't say. The Catalina surged toward them, spray flying, the aircraft shuddering with each wave impact. Behind them, shells continued to fall, the Japanese gunners adjusting their aim, trying to lead their target, trying to anticipate where the plane would be rather than where it was. Gordon made that as difficult as possible. He zigzagged across the water, never holding a straight course for more than a few seconds. The erratic movement making the Catalina a nightmare to target. It also made the ride a nightmare for everyone aboard. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Equipment went flying. The 3 survivors they'd just rescued were tumbling around the cabin like dice in a cup. Nobody complained. Nobody asked Gordon to slow down. They understood the alternative was death. The second pickup was faster than the first. The 2 men in the water had watched the first rescue and knew what to do. The moment the Catalina pulled alongside, they were already swimming toward the hatches, already reaching for extended hands. They were aboard in under a minute. A navigator named Phillips and a gunner named Morrison, both injured but conscious, both unable to believe they were actually being saved. 5 men were rescued. 10 are still in the water, and the Japanese gunners were getting closer with every shot. That's when Gordon made a decision that would define the entire mission. Any reasonable pilot would have taken off at this point. 5 survivors was a genuine success. 5 men saved from certain death were worth celebrating. The plane was still intact, still flyable, and every second they remained on the water increased the odds of catastrophic damage. Nobody would have blamed Gordon for heading home. Nobody would have questioned his courage or his judgment. He'd already done more than anyone could have expected. Nathan Gordon looked at his co-pilot and said 4 words that changed everything. 10 more out there. Ensign? Ensign nodded. He understood. They weren't leaving, not with men still in the water, not while there was even the smallest chance of saving more lives. Gordon swung the Catalina around and headed for the next group of survivors. 4 men clustered together about half a mile to the north. The Japanese gunners, realizing the rescue plane wasn't leaving, redoubled their efforts. The rate of fire increased, shells were landing closer and more frequently, and then, for the first time, they scored a direct hit, not on the main hull, that would have been fatal, but on the port wing. The shell punched through the aluminum skin like it was paper, detonating inside the wing structure, shredding internal components, and opening a hole the size of a basketball. Fuel began leaking immediately, a thin stream of aviation gasoline, immediately trailing behind the aircraft like blood from a wound. Chief Rutherford was in the cockpit within seconds, his face grim. Port wing took a hit, sir. We're losing fuel. How bad? Bad enough. We've got maybe 90 minutes of flight time left. Maybe less if we take more damage. Gordon processed this information in approximately 2 seconds. 90 minutes. They were at least 45 minutes from the nearest Allied base. That gave him maybe 45 minutes to rescue the remaining 10 men, take off from a hostile harbor, and limp home before the engines died. There wasn't enough time. It was nowhere near enough time. Gordon pushed the throttles forward and kept going. The third rescue was the most dangerous yet. The 4 men in the water were closest to the shore, closest to the Japanese guns. At this range, the enemy gunners could practically hit the Catalina with their eyes closed. Shells were landing within yards of the aircraft now. The explosions so close that crew members were being knocked off their feet by the shockwaves. The hull was taking constant shrapnel hits, new holes appearing with almost every explosion. The plane that had left base that morning as a pristine rescue aircraft was rapidly becoming Swiss cheese. But Gordon didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Those 4 men in the water, Lieutenant James Cummings, Sergeant Robert Hayes, Private First Class William Turner, and Corporal Anthony Russ, were watching the Catalina approach with a mixture of hope and horror. Hope because rescue was coming. Horror because they could see what the rescue crew was enduring to reach them. Cummings would later describe the scene in terms that bordered on the surreal. The plane was on fire, he said. I mean, not completely on fire, but flames were coming from the wing, and smoke everywhere, and shells were landing all around it. And I genuinely thought I was watching these men die trying to save me. I wanted to tell them to stop. I wanted to wave them off. But I also wanted to live. God help me. I wanted to live so badly. The pickup was chaos. Absolute chaos. Shells were landing so close that water was flooding into the open hatches. Crew members were working in knee-deep seawater, hauling survivors aboard while explosions rocked the aircraft. One shell landed close enough to lift the Catalina's tail out of the water for a moment. The entire plane was airborne, thrown by the shockwave, before crashing back down with a bone-jarring impact. Somehow, they got all 4 men aboard. Somehow, nobody was killed. Somehow, the plane was still floating. 9 men rescued, 6 more in the water, and Nathan Gordon still wasn't done. The 4th and final rescue run was the stuff of nightmares. The remaining 6 survivors were scattered across a wide area too far apart to collect in a single pass. Gordon would have to make multiple approaches, each one extending their time in the kill zone, each one burning fuel they couldn't afford to lose. The fuel leak from the wing had gotten worse. Rutherford's 90-minute estimate had been optimistic. They were now looking at maybe 60 minutes of flight time, possibly less. The Catalina's hull had taken so many hits that crew members were using life vests to plug holes, trying to slow the flooding that was gradually filling the lower compartments. The starboard engine was running rough, damaged by shrapnel, threatening to quit at any moment. And the Japanese gunners, frustrated by their inability to sink the stubborn rescue plane, had called in reinforcements. Gordon saw the first 2 small boats leaving the shore, heading toward the crash site. Japanese patrol boats, probably armed with machine guns and light cannon. They'd be on the Catalina in 10 minutes, maybe less. Once they arrived, the rescue mission was over. The boats could close to point-blank range, where their weapons wouldn't miss. They could circle the slow-moving Catalina like wolves around a wounded deer. They could kill everyone aboard, crew and survivors alike, and there would be nothing Gordon could do to stop them. 10 minutes. He had 10 minutes to rescue 6 men, take off from the water, and escape before those boats arrived. It wasn't possible. The math simply didn't work. To rescue all 6 men would take at least 15 minutes, probably 20. He'd be a sitting duck when those patrol boats arrived. He'd be signing his own death warrant and the death warrant of everyone aboard. For a moment, just a moment, Nathan Gordon hesitated, not out of fear for himself. He'd made peace with dying the moment he turned his plane toward Aviation. He hesitated because he was responsible for his crew, the men who'd followed him into this hellstorm without question. The men who'd trusted him with their lives. Did he have the right to ask them to die so he could attempt an impossible rescue? Gordon turned to his crew. He didn't give an order. He asked a question. We've got 6 men still in the water, and enemy boats closing in. If we stay, we might not make it out. If we leave, those men will die for certain. What do you want to do? The response was immediate and unanimous. Chief Rutherford spoke for everyone. We didn't come this far to leave anyone behind, sir. Get us to those men. And that was that. No debate, no hesitation. Just 7 men choosing to risk death rather than abandon strangers. Gordon nodded once, turned back to the controls, and pushed the engines as hard as they would go. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Nathan Gordon's life. He reached the first pair of survivors. 2 men clinging to a single life raft, and his crew hauled them aboard in under a minute. 11 rescued. The Japanese patrol boats were visible now, closing fast. White wakes trailing behind them as they raced across the harbor. Gordon spotted 2 more survivors, men who'd drifted farther from the main crash site and swung the battered Catalina toward them. The fuel gauge was dropping visibly. The starboard engine was coughing, sputtering, threatening to die. Water was sloshing around the cabin, the hull so riddled with holes that bailing was becoming pointless. The plane was dying around them, and everyone knew it, but they kept going. The 2 men were pulled aboard a pilot named Harrison and his bombardier, whose name would be recorded as Murphy in the official reports. 13 rescued, 2 more to go. The patrol boats were less than a mile away now, close enough that Gordon could see crew members on deck, manning weapons, preparing to fire, close enough that escape was becoming mathematically impossible. Even if he took off right now, the patrol boats might be able to pursue. The Catalina was slow, damaged, overloaded with survivors. It couldn't outrun a determined pursuit, but there were still 2 men in the water. 2 men who would die if Gordon left them. 2 men who deserved the same chance as everyone else. Gordon found them about 400 yards to the south, 2 figures in the water, barely conscious. Their life vests, the only thing keeping them afloat. They'd been in the water for hours now. Blood loss, exhaustion, shock. They were at the edge of death even without the sharks and the Japanese. If Gordon didn't get to them in the next few minutes, there would be nothing left to rescue. The Catalina limped toward them, engines straining, hull groaning. The entire aircraft held together by little more than hope and stubbornness. Behind them, the patrol boats opened fire. Machine gun bullets stitched the water around the Catalina, punching new holes in the already battered hull. A burst raked across the starboard wing, narrowly missing the fuel tanks. Another burst shattered the cockpit glass, showering Gordon and Anson with fragments. Someone in the back screamed that one of the survivors had been hit by a ricochet, a minor wound, but bleeding freely. Gordon didn't flinch. He held course. He reached the last 2 survivors just as the patrol boats closed to within 500 yards. His crew worked with desperate speed, hauling the unconscious men aboard while bullets cracked overhead. The entire rescue took 45 seconds. 45 seconds that felt like 45 years. And then they were done. 15 men. Every single survivor, all aboard. Now came the hardest part. Taking off. A PBY Catalina needed a long takeoff run under ideal conditions. These conditions were the opposite of ideal. The plane was overloaded with survivors. The hull was flooding. 1 engine was failing. They were under direct fire from enemy boats. The water was choppy, creating additional drag, and they had almost no fuel left. Gordon pushed the throttles to maximum. The engines roared. The port engine strong. The starboard engine screaming in protest but still producing power. The Catalina began to accelerate, bouncing across the waves. Spray flying everywhere. Behind them, the patrol boats gave chase, their gunners firing continuously, bullets and shells tracking the fleeing aircraft. For a long, terrible moment, the Catalina refused to lift off. The plane was too heavy. The water drag was too strong. The engines couldn't produce enough thrust. They were accelerating, but not fast enough. The patrol boats were gaining. Gordon could see them in his mirrors. 2 deadly shapes growing larger with every second. He was running out of runway, running out of options, running out of time. Chief Rutherford appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Jettison the guns," Gordon ordered. "And any equipment we don't absolutely need. Throw it overboard. Weight reduction." Every pound they lost was another fraction of speed they gained. Rutherford didn't waste time acknowledging the order. He simply turned and started throwing things out of the aircraft. Machine guns went overboard. Ammunition cans followed. Toolkits, spare parts, anything that wasn't bolted down or essential for survival. The survivors helped, understanding what was at stake, tossing their own equipment into the ocean. Even if the life rafts went, they wouldn't need them if they didn't get airborne. Slowly, painfully, the Catalina began to lift. The hull broke free from the water's grip. The bouncing stopped. The drag decreased. And inch by inch, foot by foot, the battered rescue plane clawed its way into the sky. The patrol boats fell behind, their weapons still firing but their shots falling short as the Catalina gained altitude. At 500 feet, they were out of effective range. At 1,000 feet, they were safe or as safe as anyone could be, in a shot-up aircraft running on fumes over enemy territory. Nathan Gordon allowed himself one deep breath. Then he turned the Catalina toward home and began the long, uncertain flight to Allied territory. The journey back was almost as harrowing as the rescue itself. The starboard engine quit completely about 20 minutes into the flight, forcing Gordon to feather the propeller and continue on one engine. The fuel gauge hit empty while they were still 30 miles from base. But somehow, impossibly, the port engine kept running, sucking the last drops from the tanks. The hull was taking on water faster than the crew could bail, and Gordon had to fly nose-high to keep the flooding contained to the rear compartments. Every warning light on the instrument panel was illuminated. Every gauge was reading critically. The plane was dying, and everyone aboard knew they might not make it, but they made it. Somehow, against all odds, they made it. The Catalina touched down at Samurai at 14:30 hours. 4.5 hours after Nathan Gordon had first spotted survivors in the water near Caveen. The plane barely survived the landing. In fact, it never flew again. The damage was so extensive that it was written off immediately, stripped for parts, and scrapped. But 15 men who should have died that day walked off that aircraft alive. 15 men. For landing runs in enemy waters, 90 minutes under continuous fire. One plane destroyed, but every single survivor rescued. When the brass heard what Nathan Gordon had done, they didn't quite believe it. The reports seemed exaggerated. The claims seemed impossible. No one could have done what Gordon claimed to have done, not and survived. So they investigated. They interviewed survivors. They reviewed radio logs and after-action reports. and when they finished their investigation, they reached a conclusion that surprised even them. Nathan Gordon hadn't exaggerated. If anything, the initial reports had understated what he'd accomplished. What happened next would change Nathan Gordon's life forever. But that's not what makes this story remarkable. What makes it remarkable is what happened in the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effects of one man's impossible courage, spreading outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Because Nathan Gordon's rescue wasn't just a rescue, it was a turning point. A moment that changed how the entire military thought about what was possible in combat. And the men he saved, their stories didn't end when they stepped off that battered Catalina. Their stories were just beginning. But before we get to that, there's one more thing you need to understand about February 15, 1944, something that makes Gordon's actions even more extraordinary than they already appear. Something that the official reports never mentioned, but that the survivors never forgot. And once you hear it, you'll understand why this story has haunted historians for 80 years. Here's what the official reports never mentioned. Here's what the military historians glossed over for decades. Here's the detail that transforms Nathan Gordon's story from remarkable to almost unbelievable. When Gordon landed his Catalina in Cavite Harbor for the first time that morning, he wasn't supposed to be there at all. Not just in the sense that the mission was unauthorized, that part you already know, but in a much more fundamental sense. Nathan Gordon was scheduled to be relieved of duty that very day. His rotation was over. His combat tour was complete. He had orders in his pocket. Physical, signed orders transferring him to a training facility in Australia. Safe, comfortable, far from the war. He was supposed to hand over his aircraft to a replacement crew that morning and catch a transport south. By sunset, he should have been drinking cold beer in Sydney, the Pacific War fading in his rearview mirror. Instead, he was dodging artillery shells in a harbor full of sharks. The replacement crew arrived at Samurai at 0730 hours on February 15, 1944. They found Gordon's Catalina already gone, already in the air, already heading toward a mission that wasn't on any schedule. When the base commander demanded to know where Lieutenant Gordon had taken his aircraft, the duty officer could only shrug. Gordon had received the distress calls about downed airmen near Cavite. He'd heard that survivors were in the water with no rescue authorized, and he'd simply taken off. No permission requested, no authorization given, just a man who couldn't stand the thought of other men dying while he flew to safety. The base commander was furious. Gordon had effectively stolen a military aircraft, a court-martial offense. He had abandoned his post. He had ignored direct orders about rescue operations in hostile territory. When Gordon returned, if Gordon returned, he was facing serious disciplinary action, maybe even prison. But Gordon didn't know any of this when he made his decision. Or rather, he didn't care. He'd heard men were dying, and he'd gone to save them. Everything else was noise. This detail matters because it reveals something essential about Nathan Gordon's character. He wasn't a glory seeker. He wasn't trying to earn medals or build a reputation. He was hours away from going home after escaping the war entirely, and he threw that away without a second thought. He knew there would be consequences. He knew he might face punishment. He did it anyway, because for Nathan Gordon, the calculation was simple. 15 men were going to die if nobody helped them. He could help them. Therefore, he would help them. Everything else, the orders, the regulations, the personal cost, was irrelevant. That's not ordinary courage. That's something rarer. That's a kind of moral clarity that most people never experience in their entire lives. The ability to see exactly what needs to be done, and to do it, regardless of consequences. When Gordon's battered Catalina touched down at Samurai that afternoon, the base commander was waiting on the dock. His face was red. His jaw was set. He had a speech prepared, a blistering reprimand that would strip Gordon of his rank and send him home in disgrace. The speech died on his lips. Because walking off that shattered aircraft were 15 men who should have been dead, 15 men covered in blood and oil and seawater, 15 men who were weeping openly as they stepped onto solid ground, 15 men who kept turning back to look at the Catalina, at the impossible plane that had saved them, as if they still couldn't believe any of it was real. The base commander watched these men disembark, one after another. He saw the wounds, he saw the exhaustion, he saw the naked, overwhelming gratitude on every face. And he saw the aircraft that had brought them home, a flying wreck that should have crashed 10 times over, held together by nothing but luck and the sheer force of Nathan Gordon's will. The reprimand was never delivered. The court-martial never happened. Instead, the base commander did something unprecedented. He walked up to Nathan Gordon, stood at attention, and saluted. Not a casual acknowledgement. A formal, rigid, by-the-book salute of the kind reserved for superior officers and heroes. Gordon, exhausted, blood-stained, barely standing, returned the salute. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that moment, everyone on that dock understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcended regulations and protocols and military discipline. They had witnessed one man's refusal to let other men die, and that refusal had cost him nothing less than everything he had. But Catalina would never fly again. Gordon's body was battered. He would later discover he'd cracked 2 ribs during the mission, injuries he hadn't even noticed in the chaos. His career should have been over. Instead, it was about to reach heights he never imagined. Word of what happened at Kavieng spread through the Allied forces like wildfire. Within days, every pilot in the Pacific knew the story. Within weeks, it had reached Washington. The Navy brass, initially skeptical that any pilot could have accomplished what Gordon claimed, launched a formal investigation. They interviewed every survivor. They reviewed every piece of evidence. They reconstructed the mission minute by minute, and when they finished, they reached a conclusion that would change Nathan Gordon's life forever. Lieutenant Nathan Gordon had performed acts of extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. He had risked his life repeatedly, not once, not twice, but 4 separate times, to save men who were otherwise certain to die. He had demonstrated courage, skill, and selflessness of the highest order. He deserved the highest honor the United States could bestow. On April 13, 1944, less than 2 months after the rescue, Nathan Gordon stood in a ceremony at the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty as commander of a Catalina patrol plane in rescuing personnel of the United States Army Air Forces shot down in combat over Kavieng Harbor, New Ireland, on the 15th of February 1944, on 4 separate occasions. Lieutenant Gordon landed his plane in the harbor under heavy enemy fire and rescued 15 survivors. With extreme skill and disregard for personal danger, he taxied his plane through walls of shell splashes and completed his mission with his plane badly damaged. His outstanding courage and determination were responsible for saving the lives of all 15 airmen. Those words, clinical and formal, barely hint at what Nathan Gordon actually endured. They don't capture the screaming engines and exploding shells. They don't capture the shark-infested waters and the dying men. They don't capture the terror, the chaos, the absolute certainty that each moment might be his last. But for Nathan Gordon, the words didn't matter. The medal didn't matter. What mattered was that 15 men were alive. 15 families wouldn't receive those terrible telegrams. 15 mothers wouldn't collapse in grief. That was enough. That was everything. But what happened to those 15 men? That's a question historians don't ask often enough. We remember Nathan Gordon. His name is in the history books, his Medal of Honor on display. But the men he saved, their stories are scattered, half forgotten, buried in archives that nobody visits. Let me tell you about them. Let me give them the recognition they deserve. Without their survival, their testimony, their lives, Nathan Gordon's heroism would mean nothing. Lieutenant Harold Sargent, the first man pulled from the water, the one who tried to wave the rescue plane away, survived the war. He went home to Massachusetts, married his high school sweetheart, and became a For the rest of his life, he visited Nathan Gordon once a year. Every February 15th, without fail, the 2 men would sit together and share a drink. They rarely talked about the war. They didn't need to. They understood each other in ways that words couldn't capture. Sargent died in 1987, and his obituary mentioned the rescue. But it also mentioned something else, something that reveals the true impact of that day. Harold Sargent had spent his entire teaching career telling his students about Nathan Gordon, not as a war story, as a lesson about what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept the impossible. The young sergeant with the broken arm, his name was Timothy Rafferty, and he was 20 years old when Gordon pulled him from the water. The broken arm healed, but Rafferty carried other wounds that took much longer to mend. He struggled with what we would now call survivor's guilt. Why had he lived when so many others died? Why had Nathan Gordon risked everything to save him? Was his life really worth that much? These questions haunted Rafferty for years after the war. He drifted from job to job, unable to settle, unable to find peace. And then, in 1952, he made a decision that changed everything. Timothy Rafferty became a paramedic. He spent the next 30 years saving lives from car accidents, heart attacks, and industrial disasters. By the time he retired, he had personally saved over 200 people. When reporters asked him why he'd chosen that career, his answer was always the same. A man saved my life once. I spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. Rafferty died in 1998. His funeral was attended by dozens of the people he'd saved over the years and by Nathan Gordon himself. Now an old man, who stood at the back of the church and wept, Lieutenant James Cummings, one of the 4 men rescued during the most dangerous pickup, the one closest to the Japanese gun, also survived the war. But his path was different. Cummings became obsessed with understanding what had happened to him. How had one man accomplished the impossible? What combination of skill, courage, and luck had allowed Nathan Gordon to succeed where everyone else would have failed? These questions led Cummings to an unexpected career. He became a psychologist, specializing in the study of heroism and extreme human performance. For 3 decades, he researched what makes people capable of extraordinary acts. He interviewed soldiers, firefighters, disaster survivors, and anyone who had faced impossible odds and overcome them. And at the center of his research, always, was Nathan Gordon. Cummings published a paper in 1971, one of the first academic studies of real-world heroism, and dedicated it to the man who saved my life and taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The paper was cited hundreds of times. It influenced how psychologists think about courage to this day. All because one rescue plane landed in a harbor full of sharks. Corporal Anthony Russo, another man from that third pickup, took a different path entirely. Rousseau was a devout Catholic, and the experience in Cavien Harbor deepened his faith in ways he never expected. He'd floated in that water, watching sharks circle, knowing he was going to die. He'd prayed, really prayed, with every fiber of his being for salvation. And then, a plane had appeared out of nowhere. To Rousseau, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was divine intervention, working through the hands of Nathan Gordon. After the war, Rousseau entered the priesthood. He served for 40 years in parishes across the Midwest, and every sermon he gave came back, eventually, to the same theme. God works through ordinary people. God uses human hands to accomplish divine purposes. And when you see someone in need, you don't calculate the odds. You don't weigh the risks. You act. Because that's what heroes do. And we're all called to be heroes. Father Anthony Russo died in 2001, beloved by his congregation, remembered for his warmth and his wisdom. But his most famous sermon, the one that was reprinted in religious magazines across the country, was about February 15, 1944, about a pilot who descended into hell to save 15 doomed men, about how one act of courage can illuminate the darkness for generations to come. Not every survivor's story was triumphant. War leaves scars that never fully heal, and some of the men Gordon saved struggled for the rest of their lives. Private First Class William Turner came home with what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. The sounds of the ocean triggered panic attacks. The sight of planes overhead sent him diving for cover. He couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't escape the memories of that day in the water. For decades, he lived on the margins of homeless shelters, VA hospitals, brief periods of stability followed by inevitable collapse. But even Turner's story has a redemption. In the 1990s, a journalist researching the Cavien rescue tracked Turner down. He was living in a veteran's home in California, nearly 80 years old, his body failing but his mind still sharp. The journalist asked him about the rescue, asked him about Nathan Gordon, and Turner, this broken man who had spent 50 years haunted by the war, said something that the journalist never forgot. He didn't just save our lives that day. He showed us what a human being could be. Every day since then, when I've seen someone do something kind, something brave, I think of him. I think that's what Gordon would do. I've never been able to live up to it, but I've never stopped trying. That's the thing about heroism. It doesn't just save the people who are rescued. It transforms everyone who witnesses it. It sets a standard. It proves what's possible, and that proof ripples outward, year after year, decade after decade, touching lives that the hero will never know about. Nathan Gordon saved 15 men on February 15, 1944. But through those 15 men, through their children and grandchildren, through the people they helped and inspired, through the stories they told and retold, Nathan Gordon's influence spread far beyond that single day. Mathematicians talk about exponential growth. This is what exponential heroism looks like. One act of courage, multiplying through generations, affecting thousands of lives that would never have existed without it. Harold Sargent's students, Timothy Rafferty's 200 rescues, James Cummings's research, Anthony Russo's congregation. All traceable, all connected, all flowing from one man's decision to land his plane in a harbor full of death, and Nathan Gordon himself. What happened to him after the Medal of Honor ceremony? He could have become a celebrity. He could have ridden his fame to fortune and influence. Instead, he went back to work. The Navy offered him safe assignments, desk jobs, training positions, anything to keep their newest hero out of harm's way. Gordon refused. He continued flying rescue missions until the war ended, not for glory, not for recognition, because there were still men in the water. There were still lives to save. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Nathan Gordon had flown dozens more rescue missions. None as dramatic as Cavien, none as celebrated, but each one mattered to the men he saved. Each one represented the same simple equation that had driven Gordon into Cavien Harbor. Someone needs help. I can help. Therefore, I will. After the war, Gordon returned to Arkansas. He married, had children, lived quietly, worked as an insurance executive about as far from the drama of combat rescue as you could possibly get. He didn't talk much about the Medal of Honor, didn't display it prominently, didn't seek attention or recognition. When people asked him about the war, he deflected. When reporters came calling on anniversaries, he politely declined interviews. He seemed almost embarrassed by his fame, almost uncomfortable with being called a hero. In 1989, a journalist finally got Gordon to open up about why he was so reluctant to discuss his heroism. Gordon's answer was simple and devastating. Those 15 men were going to die. Anyone in my position would have done the same thing. The journalist pushed back. Actually, sir, that's not true. You were the only one who did it. Other pilots could have. Other planes were in the area. You were the one who went in. Gordon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that the journalist remembered for the rest of his life. Maybe that's true, but I hope it isn't. I hope there are thousands of people out there who would have done what I did. I hope I'm nothing special. Because if I'm special, if what I did was rare, that means we're in trouble. That means we can't count on each other when it matters. And I refuse to believe that. I refuse to believe that most people would just fly away. Nathan Gordon died on September 9, 2008. He was 92 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including the families of the men he'd saved more than 6 decades earlier. Children and grandchildren of the 15 survivors flew in from across the country to pay their respects. Some of them had never met Gordon personally, but they knew who he was. They knew that their existence, their entire family trees, was only possible because one man had refused to accept the impossible. The eulogy was delivered by Gordon's son, who had grown up hearing very little about his father's wartime heroism. That wasn't the story he told that day. The son said, he never talked about what he did. He talked about what we should do. About helping neighbors. About stepping up when things get hard. About being the kind of person others can count on. I grew up thinking my dad was just an insurance salesman who happened to have a medal in a drawer somewhere. It wasn't until I was an adult that I understood what he'd really done. And even then, he wouldn't take credit. He'd just say, I was in the right place at the right time, as if anyone in the right place at the right time would have done the same thing. But here's the truth that Nathan Gordon never wanted to admit. Not everyone would have done the same thing. Most people faced with those odds, faced with that danger, faced with a choice between safety and sacrifice, would have turned away. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't care, but because courage is hard, because risking everything for strangers goes against every survival instinct we possess. Nathan Gordon did something that most human beings cannot do. He overrode his own self-preservation. He looked at certain death and chose it anyway. He flew into hell 4 separate times because 15 men needed him. That's not ordinary. That will never be ordinary, and pretending otherwise diminishes what he accomplished. Nathan Gordon was a hero, a genuine, uncommon, irreplaceable hero. The world is better because he existed, and the world is poorer now that he's gone. But here's the remarkable thing, the beautiful thing.